My career in law enforcement spanned 30 years, most of it spent on the graveyard shift, patrolling the long, empty stretches of highway that connect the forgotten towns of rural Nevada. You see a lot out there in the dark, things that the daylight has a way of erasing, but one call, one encounter never got erased. It was a cold November night, the kind where the wind sounds like it's whispering secrets just outside your window. I was parked off an access road on Route 89, a particularly desolate piece of asphalt, famous for two things: jackrabbits and ghost stories. I was halfway through a stale cup of coffee when I saw her, a woman walking along the shoulder, illuminated only by my headlights. She wore a thin, simple dress, completely inadequate for the biting cold, and she wasn't carrying a bag or a phone. She just walked with a steady, unhurried pace, her bare arms hugged around herself. It was 2 a.m. There wasn't a car, a house, or a gas station for at least 20 miles in either direction. Pulling up alongside her, I rolled down the window. The cold air hit me like a physical blow. "Ma'am, you all right? Need some help?" She stopped and looked at me, and her eyes were the first thing that felt wrong. They were dark, ancient, and held no surprise or fear, just a kind of weary acceptance. She simply nodded and said her car had broken down miles back. I told her to get in the back of the cruiser, that I'd take her to the next town where she could get a warm drink and call for a tow. She complied without a word, sliding onto the hard plastic seat. The moment the door closed, the car felt different, colder. I tried to make small talk, the kind you make to put someone at ease. I asked for her name, where she was from, where she was headed. Her answers were vague, monosyllabic. "Sarah, from around, just passing through." The radio, which had been clear moments before, was now a storm of static, punctuated by distorted snippets of other officers' calls. I tried fiddling with the dial, but the static only grew louder, more aggressive, as if it were trying to drown something out. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was staring straight ahead, her reflection barely visible in the dim light of the dashboard. There was no fear on her face, no anxiety. It was a profound and unsettling stillness, like a placid lake with something terrible lurking in its depths. The feeling of being fundamentally unsafe grew in my gut, a primal alarm that had nothing to do with any physical threat she might pose. She was small, unarmed, and locked in the back of my car, yet I felt like I was the one who was trapped. We drove in that tense, static-filled silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes. The highway stretched on, an endless black ribbon swallowed by the darkness ahead. I kept my eyes on the road, but my attention was fixed on the silent figure in my mirror. I remember passing the 15-mile marker for the town of Eli, a small green sign that was a beacon of civilization in that vast emptiness. I looked at the sign for no more than a second, a quick glance to register my location and estimate my ETA. It was an automatic, instinctual movement for any cop on patrol. In that single second, when my eyes returned to the road and then flicked back up to the rearview mirror, she was gone. Not hiding, not slumped over, but completely and utterly gone. The back of the cruiser was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the asphalt as the car skidded to a halt in the middle of the deserted highway. My heart
was a drum against my ribs. I turned around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the back seat, illuminating every inch of the empty space. The doors were still locked from the outside. The windows were up. There was absolutely no way out.
The first thing I did was what any cop would do. I tried to rationalize it. Did I imagine her? Was I that tired? But I couldn't deny the physical reality. The passenger door she had used was still cold to the touch on the inside, a stark contrast to the warmth from the car's heater. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scuff mark on the plastic seat where her shoe might have dragged. I got out of the car, my service weapon drawn, and scanned the desolate landscape. Nothing. Just the howling wind and the endless expanse of sagebrush under a moonless sky. I called it in, my voice shaking so badly I could barely speak. "Dispatch, be advised, my passenger, she's vanished from my vehicle." The silence on the other end of the radio was heavier than any reprimand. When the dispatcher finally responded, her voice was laced with a careful, measured confusion that I would come to know very well over the next few weeks. They sent another unit, then a canine. The dog couldn't find a scent leading away from the cruiser. There were no footprints. There was no evidence that Sarah had ever existed, except for the scuff mark and my fracturing sanity.
The internal investigation was a nightmare. I was subjected to psych evaluations, drug tests, and hours of grueling interviews. They treated me like a suspect or a madman. My report was officially classified as unfounded, a bureaucratic term for "we think you're lying" or crazy. My partner started looking at me differently, and the whispers followed me down the station hallways. I was never officially disciplined, but my career was forever tainted. I stayed on the force, but I transferred to a desk job. I couldn't bear to drive those empty highways at night anymore. Sometimes when I'm working late, I'll see a reflection in the darkened office window. A woman in a simple dress with ancient, weary eyes. I know it's just a trick of the light, my tired mind playing games. But I also know what I saw that night on Route 89. I gave a ride to something that wasn't entirely human, something that stepped out of the darkness, and when it was done with me, simply stepped back in, leaving me alone with an impossible truth that no one would ever believe.
My name is Officer Miller, and I spent 12 years with the Chicago PD, mostly working patrol in some of the city's roughest neighborhoods. You get desensitized to a lot. You see the worst of humanity, and you build a wall around yourself just to get through the shift. But there are some calls that find the cracks in that wall. This one wasn't a shooting or a domestic gone bad. It was a noise complaint. A simple, run-of-the-mill call that ended up hollowing out a piece of my soul. The call came in around 3 a.m. for a high-rise building on the south side, one of those concrete monoliths that had seen better days decades ago. The report was specific. A tenant on the 4th floor was complaining about the sound of a child crying, inconsolably, coming from the apartment directly below them, 3B. The tenant said it had been going on for hours, and they were worried. Standard welfare check. My partner, a young, eager cop named Diaz, and I took the call, expecting to find a stressed-out single parent or a sick kid.
We arrived at the building, and the first odd thing was the doorman. He was an old guy who had been working there since the 70s, and he knew everything about everyone. When we told him we were heading to 3B, his face went pale. He informed us that apartment 3B had been vacant for over 5 years, not just empty, but sealed. The last tenant, an elderly woman, had passed away inside, and she had been a hoarder. The place was deemed a biohazard by the city. It took a specialized crew weeks to clear it out, and afterward, the building's owner had the door padlocked and bolted from the outside. No one had been in or out since. The doorman swore on his mother's grave that it was impossible for anyone, let alone a child, to be inside. He looked genuinely spooked, telling us that other tenants had complained about noises from 3B before, but management always dismissed it as the building settling or pipes rattling.
Despite the doorman's story, we had to follow procedure. A report of a crying child, no matter how improbable, has to be investigated. We took the rickety elevator to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled of stale cigarette smoke and boiled cabbage. As we approached the door to 3B, we could hear it. It was faint but unmistakable, the heartbreaking sound of a small child sobbing. It wasn't loud or frantic, but a deep, sorrowful weeping that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. Diaz looked at me, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a wide-eyed apprehension. The door was exactly as the doorman described. A heavy-duty padlock was clamped through a thick steel hasp, and the frame was covered in dust and cobwebs, clearly untouched for years. There was no way to explain the sound. We announced our presence, knocking loudly. "Chicago police! Is anyone in there?" The only response was the continuation of that soft, miserable crying.
Protocol dictated we make entry. We called the building supervisor to come with the keys to the padlock and a crowbar. As he worked on the rusted lock, the crying inside seemed to get closer to the door, more distinct, as if a small child was standing right on the other side, listening to us. The supervisor was sweating and trembling, muttering that it was impossible. When the lock finally sprang open and he pried the door ajar, a wave of frigid air washed over us, carrying an overwhelming smell of dust and decay. The apartment was a barren concrete shell. The walls were stripped to the plaster, the floors were bare, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. There was no furniture, no toys, no sign that anyone had lived there for a very long time. And the moment the door was fully open, the crying stopped. Not faded, not tapered off. It just ceased, instantly, leaving a silence that was somehow louder and more terrifying than the sound it replaced.
We did a full sweep of the apartment, flashlights cutting through the gloom. It was a small, one-bedroom unit, completely and verifiably empty. The windows were sealed shut with paint and grime. There were no vents large enough for the sound to travel through from another apartment. No hidden speakers, no logical explanation. Diaz and I stood in the middle of the empty living room, the silence pressing in on us. That's when I noticed it. In the center of the dusty floor, in a perfect circle about the size of a dinner plate, the dust was disturbed. It wasn't footprints. It looked more like something had been kneeling there, rocking back and forth over and over again. The pattern was worn into the thick layer of grime, a ghostly testament to a repetitive motion. As I knelt down to look closer, my hand brushed against the floor and I flinched. The spot was warm. Not just a little bit, but noticeably, unnaturally warm, as if someone had just gotten up from that very spot.
We found nothing else. We couldn't put the warm spot or the disturbed dust in our report. We couldn't write down the soul-crushing sadness we heard in that cry. The official report reads, responded to a welfare check, gained entry to a vacant apartment, call unfounded. Diaz put in for a transfer to a different district a month later. He never said why, but I knew. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, and for a split second I can hear it, that soft, hopeless weeping. I learned something on that call. It's not the violence or the criminals that get you. It's the things you can't explain, the things you can't fight, the things you can't put in a report. It's the profound, chilling grief of a sealed and empty room that will forever haunt the quiet moments of my life.
And the final chilling detail, the one I've never told anyone. As we were leaving, I took one last look back into the empty apartment from the hallway. For a fraction of a second, I saw a small, dark shape huddled in the corner of the far bedroom. It was no bigger than a child, a smudge of deeper black against the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. But I know what I saw. We had been warned the apartment was a biohazard, but nobody ever mentioned that the hazard wasn't physical. We sealed the door, locked it back up, and left the weeping of 3B to its solitude, hoping that whatever was in there would stay there. But I have a feeling it's been crying for a very, very long time. And it will be crying long after we're all gone.
I was a rookie deputy in a rural county in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of place where the trees are older than the towns and the fog has a personality of its own. Our sheriff's department was small, and our station was an old brick building that had once been a town hall. The holding cells were in the basement, a cold, damp place that always felt disconnected from the world above. Most nights were quiet, filled with paperwork and the hum of the fluorescent lights. The horror here wasn't something that burst through a door, it was something that seeped in through the cracks, something that had been waiting there all along. It all started with the intercom system that connected the main dispatch desk to the basement cells. It was an ancient system, prone to static and picking up stray radio signals. We were used to it crackling to life with nonsense.
Our story begins with a routine arrest. We picked up a drifter for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. He was a gaunt man, probably in his late 50s, with wild, terrified eyes that never seemed to focus on anything. He didn't fight or resist, he just mumbled to himself, repeating the same phrase over and over. He sees through the cracks, he sees through the static. We processed him and put him in cell 1, the one furthest from the stairs. He curled up on the concrete bunk and fell silent. For a few hours, everything was normal. I was at the main desk, listening to the dispatcher handle a minor traffic complaint, when the intercom from the cells crackled to life. It wasn't the usual white noise. It was a deep, guttural sound, like the static was trying to form a word. And underneath it, I could hear our drifter start to scream.
My training officer, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Davis, and I ran down to the basement. The screams were blood-curdling, filled with a kind of primal terror I'd never heard before. We found the man pressed into the back corner of his cell, staring at the empty front corner where the small intercom speaker was mounted on the wall. He was pointing a trembling finger at it, his face a mask of sheer horror. "He's there! He's watching me through the noise! Make it stop!" he shrieked. We tried to calm him down, assuring him it was just a faulty speaker, But he was inconsolable. Davis, ever the pragmatist, went over and smacked the intercom box a few times. The static hissed, and then fell silent. The man, however, kept whispering his mantra. "He sees through the cracks! He sees through the static!" rocking back and forth. We chalked it up to DTs and left him, but the incident left a chill in the air.
Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening with that intercom. It would turn on by itself, always emitting that same deep, grinding static, even when the power to the unit was supposedly cut. Other deputies started hearing things. A whisper that sounded like it was right behind you. The faint sound of a name being called from the empty cells. One night, a deputy swore he heard a full, clear sentence come through the static. "I've been waiting for you." Everyone was on edge. We started avoiding the basement unless absolutely necessary. The place began to feel actively hostile, as if the building itself was watching us, listening. The temperature down there would drop suddenly, and you'd see your breath in the air, even on a warm night. We joked about it being haunted, to cover up how genuinely scared we were. The night it all came to a head, I was on duty alone. Davis had called in sick. Around 1 a.m., the intercom flared to life, louder than ever before. But this time, it wasn't just static. Through the noise, I could clearly hear two voices. One was a man, pleading and crying. The other was a low, calm, and monstrously distorted voice that spoke in a language I didn't recognize. I grabbed my mag light and my sidearm and headed for the basement stairs, my heart pounding. The voices from the intercom grew clearer as I descended. The pleading man was speaking English. "Please, no, I didn't mean to see. I won't tell anyone," he begged. The distorted voice replied with a single guttural word that made the concrete floor seem to vibrate. I reached the bottom of the stairs and peered down the dark corridor of cells. All of them were empty. The voices were coming directly from the speaker in cell 1.
As I stood there frozen, the speaker fell silent. Then a new sound began, a slow, wet, tearing sound, followed by a final, gurgling scream that was abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Then the distorted voice spoke again, this time in perfect, unaccented English, clear as a bell through the speaker, as if it were standing right next to me. "The vessel is open, the crack is wide." At that moment, the single light bulb in the hallway flickered violently, and in the strobing light, I saw him. For just a second, a tall, impossibly thin figure was standing inside the locked, empty cell. It had no discernible features, just a silhouette of pure blackness that seemed to drink the light around it. It turned its head towards me, and though it had no face, I felt its gaze. It was an ancient, malevolent intelligence. I didn't even scream. I just turned and ran, not stopping until I was outside in the parking lot, gasping in the cold night air.
I never went back into that basement. I wrote up a report about a major electrical fault in the intercom system, and they eventually had the whole thing ripped out and replaced. The strange occurrences stopped after that. The drifter was released the morning after his episode. He never mentioned it again and left town immediately. No one ever talked about what happened during those few weeks. It was an unspoken, shared trauma. I left that department a year later, but I'll never forget that voice or that shape in the cell. Some places are just wrong. They're old, and they've soaked up too much misery. And sometimes the barriers between our world and something else get thin. That old intercom wasn't just picking up stray radio waves. It was picking up a signal from somewhere else, a signal that found a willing listener in a terrified drifter and used him to punch a hole through the static, a crack for something terrible to peer through.